At one time, we thought that organisms changed kind of because they wanted to. So in this situation, we would have a giraffe gets a long neck because it needs to have a long neck, and it will stretch towards the trees, and eventually over time, it will create a longer neck in the organism. Now, we know nowadays that that's not the way it works. Evolution actually starts with mutations. So these are changes in DNA, and when the DNA changes, it can give different traits because new alleles will come about. And so these mutations will cause genetic variation within a population. So in this case, we will have some giraffes that just happen to have longer necks than others. Now, if they're in a situation like this, then in some cases those traits will be adaptations, meaning that they allow the organism to do something that's beneficial. So in this case, the longer neck allows a longer neck giraffe to get more food, and thereby it's going to be more likely to survive and reproduce. And this is called natural selection. So in this population, the frequency of the alleles that give you a shorter neck are going to decrease, and the frequency of the alleles that have longer necks are going to increase. And this is evolution, a change in the allele frequency. So if we look at that all together, mutations result in genetic variation, which is acted on by natural selection, results in some organisms being more likely to survive and reproduce, and results in the change of the organism, or change of the species or population, which is called evolution. Next, we're going to look at the evidence for evolution. So we have three types: the fossil record, anatomical evidence, and biochemical evidence. And all of these help us determine common ancestry. So with the fossil record, it gives us an evidence of how species have changed and kind of a timeline of that change. So when we look here, you can see that in the layers of rock, generally as you go down, you're going to find older organisms. And so if you find something in the same layer, you can assume that it's about the same age. And this helps us identify relative dating and gives us kind of that view of how organisms have changed. Here's a picture of some of the various human skulls placed in order in the fossil record. Anatomical has to do with structural similarities, things like bones, and then we're going to talk about a special type of structure called a vestigial organ. So this right here just shows how all of these relatively seemingly unrelated organisms all share the exact same bone structures. And this indicates that bats, humans, horses, and porpoise all share a relatively recent common ancestor. And it makes sense because they're also all mammals. This is an example of a vestigial organ. So that's something that used to have a purpose but doesn't anymore. So this whale has a pelvic bone, which is generally what land animals would have their hind legs attached to. Well, a whale doesn't have hind legs, so why does it have a pelvic bone? And that is because in its evolutionary past, it did have legs. Whales actually evolved from land-dwelling mammals. When we talk about biochemical evidence, we're looking at similar chemical makeup or processes, things like DNA, proteins, metabolic functions, that kind of thing. So if we look here, we're talking about the DNA similarities between some of these different animal groups and a certain species. And so the more similar your DNA is, the more related you are to that species. So it's really easy. The lungfish is the most related, and then it goes sharks, frogs, snakes, mice, and lemurs in order of descending similarity in DNA. Next, let's look at how evolution actually works. So first we have to kind of define what a species is. And these are genetically different populations. So for example, a bonobo and a chimpanzee, fairly similar, but they're different species because they're genetically different and they generally won't mate. Now, when we're looking at identifying organisms and how they interact, we're going to talk about the niche, because that's how an organism actually interacts with all of its environment. And then selective pressures are things that make it harder for them to survive. And these result in competition, natural selection, and it determines how adapted an organism is. So when we think about the niche, it's kind of how it gets what it needs, and then selective pressures are things that are working against that. And so your ability to get what you need in the face of these pressures is how adapted you are. Now, environments are made up of a number of different factors. We have abiotic factors, which are non-living things. Predominantly, we're looking at temperature, water, and topography. And these can all be selective pressures. So for example, you have to be adapted to the temperature, the water availability, and the topography. And organisms will all have adaptations to allow them to better operate under the conditions that they find themselves in. Additionally, you have to be adapted to the biotic factors, the living things, and things like predation, symbiotic relationships, and diseases. So for example, this first fish here is an example of getting food. The cactus is an example of not being food. There's a symbiotic relationship that allows this fish to hitch a ride. And you have to be adapted to dealing with certain diseases. For example, people that have the sickle cell trait in Africa that helps protect them against malaria. Now, when ecosystems change, organisms will either go extinct, like the woolly mammoth. Its environment changed too much, it wasn't able to adapt, and so it went extinct. They will evolve. So, for example, if you're living in a jungle environment, swinging around in the trees makes sense. But if your environment changes to a more open area plains situation, then you're going to have to change as well. And so that resulted in bipedalism, the ability to walk. Or you can speciate, meaning that you turn into a different species. And speciation can happen, like we just said, with environmental changes, but also this thing called geographic isolation. And so what geographic isolation means is you take one population, so this is all a single species, and then it becomes physically separated by something like, in this case, a river. And this prevents interbreeding between these two halves of the population. Over time, different mutations build up, and eventually we end up with two different species of trees. And so now we have two different species as a result of this. And you can see this in a lot of places. Here in North Carolina, we have a lot of this because of all the little draws and spurs. We have a lot of different salamander species because they can't make it over the land, and so they're geographically isolated from each other and they become different species.